This is a story from the days when winter was at its peak. The fog was so dense that one could barely see their own hand. Nestled deep within the mountains, far away from the bustling city, lay a small, secluded village known to the locals as Kala Chashma. A chilling rumor surrounded this place. No living soul dared to step outside after sunset. Anyone who did never returned. Aaryan was a young, determined man with a deep passion for exploring mysterious and ancient locations. Despite the frantic warnings of his friends, his curiosity drove him to visit the village. His goal was to write a detailed research piece uncovering the truth behind the legends. When Aaryan's car finally screeched to a halt near the dilapidated entrance of the village, the shadows of the evening were already deepening. An eerie silence hung heavily in the air, the kind of silence that rings sharply in your ears. As he stepped out, a freezing gust of wind struck his face, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and something ancient and decaying.
He grabbed his bag and began walking toward the heart of the village. On either side of the path stood broken, crumbling houses with windows that looked like hollow eyes staring intently from the dark. Suddenly, he noticed an old man sitting by the roadside, leaning heavily on a weathered wooden staff. His face was deeply wrinkled, and his eyes were completely, starkly white. "Son, turn back while you still can," the old man rasped in a trembling voice without even raising his head. Aaryan paused, offering a polite smile. "Old man, I'm only staying here for a few days. I just want to see what the reality of this village is." The old man let out a cold, heavy sigh and looked up at the sky, where the moon was slowly hiding behind a thick blanket of clouds. "The truth is monstrous, my boy. When darkness falls here, it isn't rain that drips from the walls. It screams, 'Leave before they see you.'" Dismissing the warning as mere superstition, Aaryan walked away. He had decided to spend the night in an old, abandoned rest house located at the far edge of the village. The clock struck midnight. Aaryan was suddenly jolted awake by a strange, repetitive sound. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded exactly like water dripping from the ceiling. Clicking his flashlight on, he aimed the beam upward. There was no water leaking. Instead, a dark, viscous stain was slowly expanding across the ceiling. As he focused his eyes, his heart skipped a beat. It wasn't water. It was thick, crimson blood. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. Swinging his legs out of bed, he rushed toward the door to escape the room. But the moment his hand gripped the cold doorknob, he froze. He could feel that someone or something was standing right on the other side, breathing heavily. Hiss, hiss. Summoning every ounce of his courage, Aaryan yanked the door open. The hallway was empty. There was only a long, pitch-black corridor, at the very end of which hung a large, dusty mirror. Though the fog made the glass murky, he could clearly see a dark silhouette standing inside the reflection. And that silhouette did not belong to him. The shadow was slowly, agonizingly, trying to push its way out of the mirror. Aaryan's breath caught in his throat. The shadow emerging from the mirror was now taking a distinct shape on the floor. It was a figure that could never be called human. Towering, draped in tattered black robes,
with nothing but a void where its face should be, save for two burning crimson eyes. Aaryan tried to step back, but his feet felt as though they were rooted to the ground. Pure terror had paralyzed his limbs. The shadow had completely stepped out of the mirror and was now advancing toward him, the old floorboards groaning and creaking under its weight.
"I warned you." A deep, monstrous voice echoed from the end of the corridor, vibrating against the walls as if a multitude of voices were speaking in unison. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Aaryan broke the paralysis, turned, and bolted back into his room. He slammed the door shut and frantically threw the bolt into place. His heart was thumping so violently he thought it would burst from his chest. He slid down the door, his back pressed hard against it. But the nightmare was far from over. The room's wooden window, which looked out over the village, began to rattle violently. A fierce storm had picked up outside, but within the howling wind, he could distinctively hear the sound of weeping and wailing. Nervously, Aaryan crept toward the window and parted the curtain just a fraction. The sight that met his eyes froze the blood in his veins. The dilapidated streets of the village, which had been completely deserted just hours ago, were now teeming with dozens of shifting shadows. They were not human. Their bodies were decaying. Some walked with broken, distorted limbs, and their agonizing cries echoed through the valley. They were the spirits of the villagers who had been slaughtered here centuries ago. Suddenly, one of the spirits stiffened, snapped its neck around, and stared directly at the rest house window where Aaryan was hiding. A horrific, unnatural grin spread across its face. It raised a pale hand and pointed a finger right at him. In an instant, the entire horde of shadows turned and began marching toward the rest house. Aaryan realized that staying in this room meant certain death. Sudden, violent thuds shook the door. Thud, 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 and the blood on the walls was now streaming down rapidly. In the corner of the room stood an old wooden chest. In a desperate bid to barricade the door, Aaryan lunged forward to push it. As the heavy chest slid across the floor, it revealed a small hidden trapdoor leading into the basement. Without a second thought, Aaryan yanked the trapdoor open and plunged into the darkness below. Just as he pulled the door shut above him, a loud, splintering crash echoed from the room. The door had given way. The shadows were inside. The basement was freezing and pitch black, smelling heavily of damp earth and rotting paper. Aaryan switched on his flashlight. As the beam swept across the stone walls, the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. The walls were covered in strange occult symbols, and right in the center of the room lay an ancient stone well. A faint, eerie red glow was radiating from the depths of the well, accompanied by the low, heavy sound of something breathing. The bitter cold of the basement seeped into Aaryan's bones, but the sweat pouring down his face betrayed his terror. From the room above, the sounds of scratching floors and heavy footsteps continued, a clear sign that the entities were still searching for him. But right now, Aaryan's attention was completely locked onto the ancient well in front of him. The faint light rising from the well was a deep crimson, exactly like the eyes of the shadow from the mirror. The breathing sound from within was shifting, turning into a low, rhythmic chant that sounded like centuries of buried grief. Steeling his nerves, Aaryan edged closer to the rim of the well. He tilted his flashlight and aimed the beam down into the abyss. There was no water. As the light pierced the dark, Aaryan saw that the inner walls of the well were carved with the exact same occult symbols he had seen on the basement walls. But the most horrifying detail lay at the very bottom. An ancient, decaying book, wrapped in a tattered black cloth. The crimson glow was emanating directly from it. Aaryan was staring intently at the book when, without warning, two skeletal, blackened hands shot up from the dark and gripped the stone edge of the well. Aaryan stumbled backward, falling heavily onto the floor. He watched in horror as a figure dragged itself out of the well. It was a woman with long, matted hair and severely charred, blackened skin. Fixing her lifeless, milk-white eyes on Aaryan, she let out a piercing shriek.
The debt of centuries must now be paid by you. The scream carried such intense agony and malice that Aaryan's ears rang. He scrambled backward on his hands and knees. When his back hit the far wall, he looked up just in time to see the trapdoor burst open. The towering black shadow from the rest house leaped down into the basement. He was trapped between two horrors. On one side was the vengeful, charred spirit of the well, and on the other was the suffocating black shadow. The only exit was blocked. The shadow glided toward Aaryan, extending a long, withered hand toward his throat. An intense, unnatural cold radiated from the entity, making it impossible for Aaryan to draw breath. "Stop!" a voice suddenly boomed from a dark corner of the basement.
It was the same raspy, trembling voice Aaryan had heard earlier that evening. Straining his neck, Aaryan looked over and saw the old village man emerging from the darkness, holding an old clay lantern. As the old man held the lantern aloft, its warm yellow glow washed over the room. The moment the light touched them, the black shadow and the charred woman recoiled violently, hissed, and retreated into the dark, seemingly terrified of the flame. "I told you to leave, boy," the old man said, grabbing Aaryan's arm and pulling him to his feet. "This village no longer belongs to the living. This well is the heart of this cursed place, and the book you saw is the chronicle of its damnation."
The old man kicked open a small, concealed wooden door in the basement wall that led directly into the surrounding forest. "Run! Follow the path through the forest straight toward the city. Do not look back." Without wasting a single second, Aaryan bolted through the door and sprinted into the stormy woods. The rain was pouring down furiously, and the dense trees loomed over him like monstrous shadows in the dark. But he hadn't gone far when he heard the distinct sound of snapping twigs and rapid footsteps close behind him. He glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see a spirit. Instead, it was the old man, running with terrifying speed on all fours like a beast, his eyes no longer white but glowing a feral, demonic red. Aaryan's mind went entirely numb. The old man he had mistaken for his savior was now pursuing him like a wild predator, scuttling over the muddy terrain on all fours with impossible speed. Froth dripped from his mouth, revealing jagged, unnaturally rotted teeth. The torrential rain slapped against Aaryan's face. He slipped and slid through the thick mud, but the sheer proximity of death awakened a primal survival instinct, forcing his exhausted legs to keep moving. "You cannot escape, Aaryan! The soil of this village demands fresh blood!"
The old man's voice was no longer human. It sounded like massive stones grinding against one another. The forest was a labyrinth. Jagged branches whipped across Aaryan's face and hands, leaving deep scratches. He had completely lost his sense of direction. He risked another glance back. The creature was closing in, mere paces away. Suddenly, Aaryan's foot caught on a thick, exposed root. He went flying forward, crashing hard into the dirt. His flashlight flew out of his hand, struck a tree, and the light died instantly. Total, suffocating darkness enveloped the woods. Through the roaring sheets of rain, he could hear the heavy, guttural panting of the creature approaching his position. Goo, goo.
Aaryan stopped breathing. Crawling frantically, he managed to squeeze himself into the hollowed-out trunk of a massive fallen tree. He clamped both hands over his mouth to muffle the sound of his ragged breathing. Through a small crack in the wood, he watched the creature halt right outside the tree. It threw its head back, sniffing the air in bizarre, jerky movements, tracking the scent of human blood. It was so close that the foul, putrid stench of its breath wafted into the hollow trunk. "I know you are here," the old man whispered. Slowly, maliciously, he began to extend his wrinkled, claw-like hand straight into the hollow opening where Aaryan was hiding. Aaryan squeezed his eyes shut, preparing for the end, silently reciting his final prayers. But just as the cold fingers were about to touch him, a blood-curdling shriek echoed from the other side of the forest. It was the charred woman from the well. Hearing the cry, the creature froze. It snapped its crimson eyes toward the sound, turned instantly, and bounded away into the darkness on all fours. Once the sounds died away, Aaryan finally exhaled, though he knew his time was running out. Crawling out of the hollow trunk, he disorientedly searched for a way out. Stumbling through the dark, he eventually spotted a massive, decaying structure in the distance. It appeared to be an ancient, abandoned church or monastery that had been sealed for centuries. A large, rusted iron cross was bolted to its heavy wooden doors.
Thinking that a sacred structure might offer protection against the spirits and the beast, Aaryan ran toward it with the last of his strength, threw his weight against the heavy doors, and burst inside. The interior of the building was even stranger than the forest. The floor was lined with hundreds of unlit candles, yet they emitted a pale, sickly yellow light that illuminated the hall. And right in the center of the sanctuary stood a massive mirror, the exact same mirror from the rest house corridor. Aaryan froze in his tracks. He approached the glass, and what he saw inside shattered his sanity. There was no ghost or shadow in the reflection. Instead, the version of Aaryan inside the mirror was weeping hysterically, pounding against the glass, using his own blood to write on the inner surface, "Save me." The most terrifying part? The real Aaryan was standing completely still. His hands were clean, and he wasn't crying at all. Aaryan's brain completely rejected the reality before him. The reflection inside the mirror was screaming at the top of its lungs, palms slamming against the glass as if desperate to break through, leaving streaks of thick blood. "Save me!" Yet the Aaryan standing outside was physically fine. He looked down at his hands. No blood. He touched his face. Dry. "This isn't real. It's a hallucination," Aaryan screamed, stepping back from the mirror. Suddenly, he noticed that his own shadow, cast on the stone floor by the sickly yellow candlelight, was moving independently. It detached itself from his feet, writhed on the ground, and slowly stood upright on its own. Creak. Creak. The ancient wooden beams of the ceiling groaned as the massive, billowing black shadow descended from above, landing silently. Simultaneously, the heavy church doors slammed open with a deafening crash. Drenched in rain, the old man on all fours and the charred woman from the well crept inside. But this time, they didn't attack. They bypassed Aaryan entirely and fell to their knees before the mirror, bowing their heads as if paying homage to royalty. Aaryan backed up until his spine hit the stone wall. His heart was hammering so hard it felt like it would crack his ribs. Inside the mirror, the crying had stopped. The trapped reflection raised its head, and a horrific, sinister smile stretched across its face. A grin so malicious it sent a wave of absolute ice down the real Aaryan's spine. The reflection placed its hand against the glass, This time, there was no resistance. The hand passed right through the surface of the mirror into the physical world. Solid, flesh and blood human hand. "Thank you, Aaryan," the entity whispered as it stepped completely out of the mirror. Its voice was an exact replica of Aaryan's, but laced with a chilling.
For centuries, this village has needed a living vessel to walk into the outside world. By coming here, you have finally paid our debt. Aaryan tried to lunge forward, but his legs were entirely paralyzed, feeling as though they had fused with the stone floor. A deep, absolute cold was taking over his body, turning his skin a ghostly, translucent white. He looked back at the mirror. The reality was flipping. The forest, the interior of the church, everything outside was now being pulled into the background of the mirror. Aaryan felt an invisible, irresistible force dragging his consciousness deep into the glass.
"No! This can't be happening!" Aaryan tried to scream, but his voice emerged as a faint, hollow echo, exactly like the muffled cries that had previously come from within the mirror. The sinister doppelganger was now fully anchored in the real world. He casually picked up Aaryan's weathered backpack, adjusted the collar of his jacket, and turned to look at the real Aaryan, who was now completely, irrevocably trapped inside the glass prison.
The old man, the charred woman, and the towering black shadow now stood submissively behind the new Aaryan, awaiting his command. Now you can write the true story of this village, forever, the entity said with a smile. He turned, threw open the heavy church doors, and stepped out into the forest, where the first light of dawn was finally beginning to pierce through the heavy fog. The suffocating silence of the village had lifted, for it had finally claimed its prize. And inside the mirror, the true Aaryan remained, condemned to spend eternity, trapped within the walls of a cursed village from which no one ever returns.